Greetings. So I was looking at this flyer for a Vigil of All Saints event, which will be happening at St. Anne's Novitiate in Queens, New York. And while doing so, I thought to myself that perhaps I should try to make a quick video about Halloween. Now, St. Anne's Novitiate is right behind the Queens of Peace residence, which is a place specifically for the elderly, ran by Little Sisters of the Poor. But that specific event aside, this week, vigils preceding All Saints' Day will be happening at various Catholic churches and perhaps a few more liturgically minded Protestant churches all over the country. For those who don't know, on the Catholic calendar, the Feast of All Saints falls on the 1st of November. As is the case with various feasts, certain churches hold a vigil the night before. So the Vigil of All Saints, or Vigilia Omnium Sanctorum, falls on the night of the 31st of October. On your screen, you can see the entry for that vigil in the old Missale Romanum, the old Roman Missal. Now, while today we say the feast is for All Saints, in older forms of English it was called All Hallows, as hallow is an archaic English word for saint or holy person. And just as the vigil before Christmas is called Christmas Eve, where Eve is short for evening, the vigil before the Feast of All Hallows was once called All Hallows Even. That got colloquially contracted into Hallow-Even, and then later became Halloween. At this point, the popular question then becomes, so the Catholic Church celebrates Halloween? The simple answer is yes, but the more nuanced answer is it depends on what you mean by Halloween. For example, if one reduces the vigil to the darker aspects which are now part of secular celebrations of Halloween, like, for example, the dressing up as witches and devils, then there's a problem and there's also a need for clarification. I would propose that we distinguish between the vigil itself and those folk accretions which some associate with their secular celebrations. For example, the event which I mentioned at the beginning of the video won't be having a celebration of demons and witches. Rather, the night is dedicated to prayer and discussion and contemplation on the various saints. To explain the distinction between a feast or vigil on the one hand and some secular accretion on the other, I'd like to offer an analogy turning to YouTube. Let me just go to the search here, and I just need to switch my keyboard here, switching it to Hebrew. Okay, I'm going to search for Satan Purim, and let's see what we get. And we see that we get a bunch of different videos, and they're all for Purim, which is a feast mentioned in the Bible, actually in the book of Esther, in the 9th chapter. However, these videos are made by secular Israelis, and they're treating Purim somewhat similar to the way secular folks in North America treat Halloween, dressing up in costumes, and some of them even dressing up like demons. For example, this first one is titled Madrichi Pur Purim Satan, literally a makeup tutorial for Purim as Satan. And it literally says Satan. The next video is the same thing, Ipur Kal Lichbod Purim Satan, easy makeup for Purim, Satan. And you can see the red horns in the image. And this one here strikes me as particularly scary. The title is Madrichi Pur Li Purim, other words, a makeup tutorial for Purim, and then it adds Satan mitachad liwer, literally Satan under the skin. Here, let's actually take a look at what happens in this video. As was mentioned in the video title, this secular Israeli woman paints her face in such a way as to depict Satan as existing just under her skin, and she's doing this as part of a secular celebration of Purim. That's literally what that means. Satan mitachat liwer means Satan under the skin. Okay. Now, the point of this analogy is that we should be able to distinguish between the biblical feast of Purim and these sorts of darker secular celebrations which go by the same name. Just as we don't have to hold Purim accountable for the darkness that goes on in some secular Israeli celebrations during that feast, by the same token, we shouldn't have to hold the Vigil of All Saints responsible for the darkness that goes on in some secular American celebrations during Halloween. In an attempt to drive this point home a bit further, I'd like to turn to the 1611 King James Bible. This is worth doing because many, not all, but many, of the critics of Halloween whom I personally encounter seem to be King James onlyists, or at least they're folks who prefer the King James Version of the Bible over other translations. So for me, it's interesting to see how King James and the translators who produced the translation he commissioned them handled this subject. The original King James Bible of 1611 actually included a calendar listing the feasts and fasts of the Anglican Church. So, for example, on your screen, you see the page for the month of February. Zooming in, one sees that on the line for the second day of the month is listed a feast for the purification of Mary. Then you'll notice in the entry just above that, for the first of the month, is the word fast. So the feast of the purification of Mary was preceded by a fast. Turning to the month of March, we find another example of this. On the line for the 25th day of the month, one finds the Feast of the Annunciation, recalling when the angel Gabriel told Mary she would have a son. Immediately above that, the entry for the 24th lists a fast. So the Feast of the Annunciation was preceded by a fast. We find another example when we turn to the month of December. On the 25th is unsurprisingly listed Christmas, or the Feast of the Nativity. And on the day prior to that, the 24th, one finds another entry for a fast. So the Anglicans who produced the King James Version of the Bible would have recognized Christmas Eve as a time for fasting in the lead up to the Christmas feast. With that pattern before us, we can now look at the months of October and November. Zooming in on November 1st, we see that the day marked the Feast of All Saints. Now, the day before the 1st of November would be the 31st of October. So turning to the entry for October, we can scroll down to the 31st, and sure enough, we find a fast listed. This means that just as the Anglicans who produced the King James Version saw Christmas Eve as a time of fasting, so too they saw All Hallows Eve, or the Vigil, or the eve prior to All Saints' Day, as a time for fasting. The same page even lists scriptures to be read at that time. Now, think about the implications here. The Anglicans who produced the King James Bible marked All Hallows Eve on their calendars, but they did not dress up as demons, or at least there's no reason to think that they did, or much less through drinking parties or dressed up like witches. Now, that should make it obvious that the darker aspects of secular Halloween celebrations are not actually essential to the vigil. They're not an essential part of the vigil. Now, since the Bible has been brought up, some might wish to ask, where is Halloween in the Bible? The short answer is that Halloween is not mentioned in the Bible. However, that leads to a second question. Should we consider it problematic that the relevant feast and its preceding vigil are not found in the Bible? I'd propose that the answer is no. To understand why, first note that John 10:22 makes a passing reference to the Feast of the Dedication, also now known as Hanukkah, or known in Hebrew as Hanukkah. Now, that's not a feast which was commanded by God in the Bible. Rather, it was one which was established by the believers. For example, one can find reference to the establishment of Hanukkah in 1 Maccabees 4:59. So, too, there is the aforementioned Feast of Purim, or Purim. That, too, was not commanded by God in the Bible. Rather, it was established by believers, as is covered in Esther 9:27. In the Bible, there were certain men who were given positions of authority. For example, you can see the authority to, quote-unquote, open and shut, which was bestowed upon Eliakim in Isaiah 22:22. I would propose that such an authority included an ability to establish new feasts. Moreover, in the New Testament, we see a parallel authority to, quote-unquote, bind and loose bestowed upon the episcopacy in Matthew 16:19 and then again in Matthew 18:18. The overall picture painted by these various verses is that the believers can establish new feasts. Once that's understood, the Vigil of All Saints, not being mentioned in the Bible, need not be considered problematic, as it would simply be a vigil or feast established after the closing of the canon. Before closing, I wanted to touch on the subject of Samhain. Since at least as far back as James Frazier's late 19th century book, The Golden Bow, it has been popular to claim that Halloween comes from Samhain. or that the date for Halloween was deliberately moved to coincide with the date of Samhain. Adding to this sentiment is the fact that today modern neo-pagans celebrate Samhain on the 31st of October on the Gregorian calendar. So this begs the question, was the date of All Hallows and its vigil moved to line up with an already existing Samhain? Well, first and foremost, note an interesting point made by Robert A. Davis's article, Escaping Through Flames, Halloween as a Christian Festival, which is found in the book Trick or Treat, Halloween in a Globalizing World by Malcolm Foley and Hugh O'Donnell. The following is stated on pages 29 and 30. Quote, the only intact pre-Christian Celtic calendar to have so far been discovered, the 2nd century Coligny calendar from Gaul, makes no mention of Samhain. Note furthermore that on page 76 of Clive Ruggles' book Ancient Astronomy, an Encyclopedia of Cosmologies and Myth, it is pointed out that the Coligny calendar, that was just mentioned, was a lunar solar calendar. This is a significant detail to remember, and thus I'm going to return to it in a moment. But just note for now that the earliest Celtic Celtic calendar was lunar rather than solar. That is to say, it was more like the Hebrew calendar than the Julian calendar. Now, note that the Vigil of All Saints already fell on the 31st of November by the 8th century. Meanwhile, the oldest extant reference to Samhain is the Tochmak Emir, which dates to the 10th or 11th century. Kuno Meyer actually did an English translation of the Tochmak Emir for the 1888 volume of the Archaeological Review. And when one reviews that text, they find that Samhain only comes up twice, and neither reference is particularly informative. For example, the text itself does not establish on what date Samhain falls. To find a reference to the date of Samhain, you have to go to other texts which post-date the 11th century. So, to recap, note first that there is no evidence that Samhain fell on the 31st of October before Halloween did. Second, note that the Celtic calendar was originally lunar or lunar solar. So hypothetically speaking, if Samhain was part of an older pre-Christian Celtic calendar, it could not consistently fall on the same date on the Roman solar calendar used by the church. It would have to be moved from a lunar calendar date to a solar calendar date in order for it to consistently fall on the 31st of October. Third, note that even if, hypothetically speaking, Samhain fell on the 31st of October on the Julian calendar, once the church adopted the Gregorian calendar in the late 16th century, at that point Samhain and Halloween should have fallen on separate days. In order for Samhain to fall on the same day as the Gregorian calendar's 31st of October, it would mean Samhain had to be moved, perhaps moved yet again. In short, on multiple levels, the conclusion is that rather than Halloween being moved to coincide with Samhain, it seems the evidence points in favor of the reverse being the case. So-called quote-unquote pagans have historically been moving Samhain to coincide with Halloween. On that note, I hope you enjoyed this short video, and I look forward to the comments of others. In the meantime, I hope people have a happy, healthy, and spiritually fulfilling Halloween. I know I'll be going to church on that day. God bless.